right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's NASEO webinar, which is a joint webinar between the Powering Up Data Centers webinar series and your usually scheduled NASEO Energy Security Committee. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Campbell Delahoyd. I'm NASEO's Senior Program Director for Energy Security and Resilience, and I'll be walking you through a few housekeeping items before we get to the good stuff today. Today's webinar is focused on maintaining energy security and reliability goals amid data center load growth. We have a fantastic panel and a fantastic moderator coming up today. But before we dive into that, did want to first go over a few items about NASEO for those of you that may be joining us for the first time. NASEO is the only nonprofit association for the governor-designated energy officials from each of the 56 states and territories. We serve as a resource for and about the state energy offices through topical committees, including the Energy Security Committee, regional dialogues, and informational events that facilitate peer learning, best practice sharing, and consensus building. Additionally, we advance the interests of the state and territory energy offices before Congress and the administration. A couple quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. We do ask you to please put your microphone and camera on mute or off until the Q&A sessions and the facilitated discussion session at the end. For those of you that are attending or that have attended other data center webinars, this is a little different format with the hybrid NASEO Energy Security Committee joint webinar. We wanted to keep it in the standard meeting format to allow for greater discussion and questions and deeper dives when we get to those sections. So there will be plenty of opportunities, but we do encourage you to drop any questions or thoughts into the chat, and we'll relay them to our moderator and to our panelists as we're able to, and point them in that direction at the appropriate times. Quick overview of the agenda today. We'll kick it off with a brief overview and some insights from Dave Althoff, Jr., the Director of the Energy Programs Office with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And then we have two great panelists today that will provide some insights on data center, cybersecurity, reliability, and general energy security issues. There's a lot of different questions that we at NASEO have received about this. And we'll be looking to our panelists to help us navigate some of those questions and point everyone in the direction of some actionable answers and specific items to take away and follow up on following this webinar. So I'll introduce our two panelists real quick. First, we have Mike Tucker with the United States Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the United States Department of Energy. And we also have Scott Aronson, who's the Senior Vice President for Energy Security and Industry Operations at Edison Electric Institute. So without any further ado, I will take these slides down and pass it over to Dave for some initial thoughts and opening remarks. Dave, the floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. As Campbell said, thank you, Campbell and Catherine and NASEO, for obviously putting together this, I believe, the fourth webinar in this Powering Up Data series. I'm a big supporter of NASEO, and I'm a member of the board of directors. I've actually been attending NASEO meetings since 2009. I've been working in our state energy office since 1998. So I really know that energy security and the role that plays in the importance of our energy office is very, 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 very important. I'm fond of saying that I think that energy security and planning is not just a project within our office, it's a program. And more and more, we think about cybersecurity and how that plays into our energy systems and how secure we feel. Part of what our goals and roles and duties as a state energy office is being subject matter experts in energy and developing energy plans, energy security plans, affordability plans, maintaining energy supplies and maintaining situational awareness for our governors related to energy. And of course, the topic of the day, I said a couple months ago that I think 2025 will go down as the year of data centers. There's not a day that goes by that I'm not talking about data centers. We're not concerned about the proliferation and the energy needs of data centers. Recently, my governor, Governor Shapiro, announced a $20 billion deal with Amazon relative to the development and the deployment of data centers in Pennsylvania. And over the course of our efforts here in the State Energy Office, we are certainly leaning forward into new technologies, and we're looking towards additional energy growth. Pennsylvania is an energy generation state. We are resource rich. We have pipelines and transmission lines and nuclear power plants and natural gas fracking. Marcellus Shale is within our borders. And so all of these energy systems also need to be secure. Just because you have an overabundance of energy does not mean that it is necessarily secure. Along with this comes the idea of increased demand from electrification, increased demand from onshoring manufacturing, and of course, increased demand from data centers. And as we think about disruptions that we have had, even recently, over the last several years, some of those involve cybersecurity issues. Some of those involve operations which are essentially crimes. And they're a bit mysterious to us as a state energy office. So when we talk about cyber and we talk about the implications of cyber on our energy systems, I think that we as an energy office are still trying to figure out what exactly that means and how to talk about it and how to become more secure around that. Take that and wrap it into data centers and the predicted proliferation of data centers and where will they occur and how much power will they use and will they bring their own device and how do they interconnect with the grid and what does that really mean? So essentially there's questions stacked upon questions that I see with regards to this connection of data center growth and then the cybersecurity concerns around that. So, while my office is located within our Department of Environmental Protection, and we are also the climate program, we do not, while in partnership with our Public Utility Commission, we do not regulate electricity or capacity per se. But we do certainly have a role in grid resilience and reliability. And we do have a role in helping to develop these subject matter expert reports and provide counsel to the governor to determine what roles we should play, what should we require, what do we need of data centers, and what are potentially some of the contributing factors that may be detrimental to the energy system as we know it. So I think today's panelists and the panel that Campbell and NASEO has put together is very timely, and I am certainly going to be listening and hopefully injecting some questions. I encourage you to put your questions into the chat. We want to make sure that we answer your questions, but should you not have any, I'm prepared to ask some myself of the panelists. But I encourage you to listen up and think about what this might mean for you or for your state, how this connection of data centers and cybersecurity is going to live going forward and what we need to know from it. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Campbell. Am I turning it back to you or am I just turning it over to Mike?
I'll happily do a quick handoff. All right. Mike, barring that it's quiet enough, we'd like to now invite you to provide remarks. And Dave and I will stay on camera to receive you. I know you're in transit.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Campbell. Can you hear me okay? Not too much background noise?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Dave. So I'm Mike Tucker. I'm a senior subject matter expert for cyber and energy systems at the Department of Energy's Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security and Emergency Response, which thankfully has an acronym, CESER, C-E-S-E-R. And I'm also the technical analysis lead for a new program within the department called the Energy Threat Analysis Center. Again, thank you for inviting me to the NASEO webinar series. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk to state energy officials about a fast growing challenge that's going to be happening over the next several years with regards to data centers, artificial intelligence applications. I won't belabor the point. I think David hit it pretty well. The unprecedented surge in electricity demand projected to consume significantly larger portion of the U.S.'s total electricity by 2028. I want to give you some numbers, though, because you may not quite have seen it all yet within the stark contrast here. So based on reports from the United States Energy Information Administration, as well as Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, we project electricity consumption for commercial computing to become the fastest growing end use in commercial sector. So if you have been hearing a lot about air conditioning and space heating and things like this in your previous discussions with your utility partners, the EIA's Energy Outlook 2025 forecasts that commercial computing could surpass space cooling and ventilation across the sector by around 2050. So it is exceedingly fast growing. In 2023, data centers consumed approximately 4.5% of total US electricity. By 2028, it's projected to increase, potentially reaching 6.7% to 12% of total US electricity. And remember, this is while the total US electricity is set to grow anyway, regardless of AI and regardless of data center consumption. So growth is driven by these industrial investments and technological innovation in America. These are positive indicators of economic and technological leadership, but it presents a challenge for our energy supply and our infrastructure. And the DOE is committed to addressing this proactively to ensure we can meet this demand reliably and affordably. And we have a multi-pronged approach for this. This is a comprehensive strategy to address this expected demand. We're focusing on 4 primary areas: streamlining the development processes, leveraging federal resources where we can in order to move things quicker or move things in specific ways that can be quicker and more capable, advancing diverse energy solutions, including nuclear, as David said earlier. As a former nuclear worker in Pennsylvania, I can tell you nuclear power presents a fascinating capability for a diverse energy, for a new and incredibly powerful energy solution for this. And then supporting grid modernization itself. You can have as much generation as you like, but if you can't move it to the point of demand, you're in a different type of problem. On streamlining permitting, I'll try to keep my comments brief. Department of Energy has announced new updates to NEPA, the National Environment Policy Act procedures that we have. These reforms are part of a government-wide effort to cut red tape and to accelerate critical energy infrastructure projects. We want to move faster. These changes are designed to foster a more disciplined, predictable, and faster permitting regime and enable energy projects to proceed without undue delay. I'll be sending some links along to Campbell afterwards that'll give you a little bit more detail into some of these major components as well. Second, we've announced plans to leverage our land, federal land and assets for data center and AI infrastructure development. We have 16 potential federal sites positioned for rapid data center construction. These sites often benefit from an existing energy infrastructure that the department has put in place for many years, as well as the people, processes, and technology. And the potential exists for fast-track permitting for new energy generation, including nuclear power. An RFI was released to engage data center and energy developers. This went specifically to them. And I believe you can view it on our website as well. And it does aim to foster these really important public-private efforts. The goal is to commence the operation of AI infrastructure at select DOE sites by the end of 2027. Number 3, advanced energy solutions and diverse energy solutions, and focus on nuclear. So given continuous high power demands of data centers, all right, they want to run them at 100% all the time. DOE is actively exploring and promoting an energy solution series of projects. Nuclear power in particular is being examined as a strong partner for data centers due to many inherent advantages. Now, I won't go into all of them here, but I do want to note there is a potential for existing plants in this particular piece, even decommissioned plants. We are exploring opportunities to utilize existing or repower retired nuclear plants. And that's exemplified by a recent power purchase agreement involving Microsoft and Constellation Energy to support data center operations at 3 Mile Island Unit 1. David, you just keep coming up in this conversation. While nuclear power offers significant advantages, we also recognize challenges. There's time required to build new reactors. There's large initial capital costs. There's a potential for behind-the-meter arrangements that need to be addressed, and the need to bolster the nuclear fuel supply chain as well. More reactors means more fuel. DOE actively engaged in addressing these hurdles through R&D, infrastructure development, as well as policy engagement. And lastly, broader DOE programs and support, and I'll keep this one brief as well. Beyond these specific initiatives, we have a wide array of programs and resources to support the energy system's ability to meet data center growth. What we want to do is enable data center flexibility through select on-site power generation and storage solutions, allowing them to function in many different ways that can support reliability. Leverage energy community opportunities, such as reusing infrastructure at retired facilities, such as coal facilities, and leverage them as data centers or for their associated power infrastructure, which is already in place and may be underutilized. Engage stakeholders on rate structures to support data center expansion while maintaining affordability, and then commercializing key enabling technologies, next generation geothermal, nuclear, storage, as well as efficient semiconductor technologies, and yes, energy efficiency efforts, because all of these data center pieces require cooling as well. Overall, we've got about 30 programs that can support data center energy needs and offer resources, especially to state energy offices, through tools like DOE's Electricity Demand Growth Resource Hub. Again, comments will come later. We also provide, or not comments, excuse me, links will come later. And we also provide technical assistance to states, utilities, and grid operators through initiatives as well. And that concludes my opening comments. So I don't want to belabor the point too much. I can take questions, Campbell, or we can just move on.
Well, Mike, why have you for a couple minutes? You know, it was great to get that overview. Could you speak a little bit towards, you know, the cybersecurity risks and you know, how CSER may be addressing, you know, cybersecurity risks around data centers, understanding that like power gen is power gen and data centers are consumers of power gen. But you talked about grid modernization. There's the you know, interconnection of, you know, new power sources, significant new power sources. What are some of the cybersecurity elements or cybersecurity risks that we should be thinking about?
Sure thing. So data centers as themselves, like you pointed out, are load. And the way that they fit within our current construct, all right, the construct that we would be working with today, is they would be fit in as load. They would be planned as load. Their maxes and their mins and their operating profile will be put into the system, put in the planning system, and they would be managed in that particular way. However, there is an opportunity for these systems, as they are reasonably flexible. All right, computing doesn't need to happen instantaneously. There can be scheduling of computing. In fact, this harkens back to the 1970s at that point when it came to scheduling your job in the computer lab at different points. I guess maybe 70s and 80s at this point. But there is a recognition that there's an opportunity to look at these a little bit differently than other load, like regular commercial building load or things like this, just because of their size and the way that they operate and the opportunities that that involves. From a state energy office standpoint, awareness of the interconnection nuances with the electric grid is really important from a cybersecurity perspective. The systems that interconnect them to the grid need to be well hardened against cybersecurity type risks, ensuring that the partners who are doing those connections, i.e. your utility partners and grid owners and operators in your region, are well aware of the differences that data center load may bring to their particular planning process, and then how that filters down into the actual upgrades that are made in order to, you know, ensure reliability across the grid during, you know, all conditions that the data center might be operating. So that interconnection nuance is big. It's an understanding of the risks with metering infrastructure. There's substation automation components here. ensuring that there's appropriate electrical infrastructure within the actual data center as well that can support good reliability too, because they are so large. Their infrastructure is often almost as important as the substation that's directly outside, as well as communication pathways between the data center energy management systems and the utility control centers. All right, as communications between these two increase, as those opportunities to do things like demand response or frequency response or curtailment or things like this are realized within the data center, those communication pathways are going to be really, really critical when it comes down to it, and need to be at the forefront of a cybersecurity concern. So there's also a cybersecurity of on-site generation and other local assets. So if they're using large battery storage or microgrids, or let's say like unique cooling solutions is another way I've heard it put. These are things like ice generation systems so that you can store ice for later on in the day. There's all kinds of interesting stuff going on here. These are resources that are mostly aligned with the data center itself, but have an impact on its operations. If they go down or if they're unable to work, that can potentially increase how much power is coming from the data center without, or is required for the data center at times. All right, so this is one of those things where the grid planners need to be involved to know what happens there. Lastly, supply chain risks associated with hardware and software used in the infrastructure. All right, these are large consumers of load. All right, they are computing loads primarily. They are unique, and many of these components can come from places that we want to ensure, have our best interests at heart. And then have an understanding of the intelligence sharing mechanisms that are available for both energy users, all right, the data centers themselves, but also the providers. All right, if the providers are more aware of potential threats, they're going to make better decisions as well. Does that make sense? Or did I take that way too long?
Yeah. Well, you took it exactly where I wanted to take it, and I want to ask you. I'm looking, Campbell. Stop me if there's a question in the chat. Otherwise, I'll ask another question here. I think one of the, maybe not concerns, but like the easy connections that we make is that when we think of cyber events, right, we think of essentially like a hacking event, right, which is sort of like computer based, right, and so ultimately we're thinking about these data centers as computing centers, right? So these two things are already now sort of connected together. We're using copious amounts of power to essentially do data and computing, whether that be hyperscalers or in the cloud or whatever that may be. And so it would seem that these are professionals in this space, right? And so therefore they should ultimately be cyber secure. They're essentially dealing in that world. This is what they do. Are there essentially cybersecurity plans that a data center or a hyperscaler or somebody who's essentially building an AI an AI data center, is there something that we should be looking for them to have? Like, is there an industry standard, or is that something that we should be talking about?
I think as far as the standard goes, that's probably something we should be talking about, and we should be engaging the owners and operators of these data centers. I think we've all run into situations in the past where someone who owns a thing is very concerned about the thing that they own and making sure that it operates the way that they intend it to operate, and that it continues to provide value for them. And that's the way of the world. All right, at that point. All right, but the other side of this too is that they're part of a community, they're part of an ecosystem, they're part of an infrastructure, and ensuring that they understand that actions that they take, all right, impact the rest of that infrastructure, and can often impact it in ways that are detrimental to their own operations, but also detrimental to the community in which they operate, is something that they need to know. One of the things that state energy officials, I think, have an opportunity to do here is to engage those folks who are building these centers in your communities, all right, and facilitate the same level of information sharing that your energy sector partners get, your other critical infrastructures get, so that they have an understanding of what the risks are and what their on balance, what their responsibilities are as well. And that is a good place to start because, in all honesty, that's easy and cheap. And that's the thing that leads to standards, and that leads to good practices, and that leads to an awareness that actions taken by one party can affect multiple others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, and I would add to that. What we're also seeing is that um, sometimes there's growth, right? Like you may start with a 200 megawatt data center, right, which is moving its way towards becoming a 1 gigawatt data center or 2 gigawatt data center. But ultimately, you have to start this at the beginning, right? Like you have to have your cyber plans, you have to have your security and reliability plans, whether you're doing on-site generation or you're starting simply by pulling power from the grid. Um, Maybe you could talk about that just quickly, like the different sizes. They don't all come in the same shape or sizes, right? But ultimately, the problem is all the same.
Yeah, the behind the meter challenge, I believe, is what you're basically asking about here.
Yes.
So behind the meter on this one provides, if you locate generation behind the meter, what you have effectively done is that you've said, hey, I'm not going to participate in the reliability piece of this. And the department recognizes that that is, a potential issue here. That's why we're looking to streamline the planning process and the permitting process, because the sooner we can get to planning and permitting, the quicker we can get the required upgrades in place, and then they can do what they want to do without these types of, on-site type generation agreements, which are very much not something that you can continue with in a lot of cases. You can put in, X many turbines, or you can put in, some on-site generation, but is that going to fully facilitate the plans of this data center owner? Is that going to fully realize what they want to do with it? Well, probably not. All right. The grid can support a whole lot more when it comes down to it. And ensuring that those folks understand that those decisions that they're making up front actually make it more difficult for us to make a much longer term investment in what they're attempting to do is a big deal. So, if you put in 200 megawatts of on-site generation, that's 200 megawatts you don't have to pull from the grid. It's 200 megawatts you don't have to upgrade the grid to handle. You don't have to do all the additional studies. You're not part of the queue. But then, of course, you also are not part of the queue. You're also not part of, you know, upgrades that may take 2 years in advance. And so ensuring, especially through your state PUC folks and other avenues that you may have within your state, as well as like federal support on this one where we can give it, in the terms of guidance and in terms of our relaxing of certain restrictions, leveraging those to make sure that folks know, oh, this is temporary. If you want to grow past a certain point, you're going to need to do some additional work on the grid itself. All right. And what I can also say is that these grid improvements, all right, past 50 years of electric power development, grid improvements are a net benefit to everyone. A more resilient, more capable, all right, more throughput enabled power grid, all right, is a rising tide that lifts all boats, especially in coming, electrification type scenarios. So hope that made sense.
Absolutely, and I think we'll let you go now because I know that you're in travel, and we don't want to dig too far
I've
into
got
what's.
another I got another 10-15, so I should be okay.
Okay, good,
I kind of
and
want to hear what Scott says too. So
absolutely. And I'm going to the Crane Energy Center on Monday, which is what you mentioned. That's the new name of the restart of the TMI facility by Constellation to essentially power that upcoming data center. So yeah, it's very, very timely that we're talking about this. So Campbell, I'll throw it back to you to tee up Scott.
Great. Well, I'll keep this transition pretty quick and introduce Scott Aronson with EEI for our next set of remarks. So, Scott, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Campbell. You guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, cool. Thank you, Campbell. Thank you, Dave. And I always like going after Tucker. Always learn a little something, and I get to say a lot of me toos and call back to some of his remarks. So huge appreciation to NASEO for putting this on. And I was really interested to find out that you guys have these particular working groups. And so it was a privilege to be able to talk to you. A little bit about me and EEI. I think most of you know EEI, where the trade association represents all of the nation's investor-owned electric companies. I also serve as part of something called the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, the ESCC. which brings CEOs from all segments of the sector. So not just the investor owners, the co-ops, the munis, the independent power generators, our Canadian partners, because it is a North American grid, to prepare for and respond to all hazards. I lead for EEI a group that is now called Energy Security, title of today's conversation, and Industry Operations. And my previous life is in policy, but focused mostly on cyber and physical security. So that nexus that Mike was just talking about of cyber threats and the grid, and all hazards, frankly, not just cyber and physical, but storms and fires and earthquakes and pandemics and the zombie apocalypse, doesn't really matter, right? When there is impact to the grid, there is impact to national security, and we are critical infrastructure because we're critical to national security and critical to the health and safety of the communities that we serve. I bring that lens to the topic that we're talking about today. Yes, energy security, maybe in its traditional forms, how do we protect the grid, but also resource adequacy? How do we meet demand for national security and U.S. economic competitiveness? And something Mike said at the very end there, I want to really closely associate myself and EEI's members with, which is the value of the grid. It is a rising tide that lifts all boats, right? The grid and EEI's members, but just the electric companies broadly, are an ecosystem, a platform that enables so many other things. And I'll give you a couple of anecdotes and a couple of pithy ways to think about it. One of my favorites is having a distributed resource of any sort, whether it's a solar panel on somebody's roof or a large co-located generator serving a data center, having that asset not connected to the grid is like having a computer not connected to the internet. Yes, you get some of the value out of that asset, but you don't get the full value out of being part of that broader ecosystem, that broader platform. Mike also ran through the growth that we are seeing. So I don't want to be repetitive, but I will say we are seeing growth that none of us in our careers have ever seen. Last 30 years, give or take, we've had flat or declining. Now, because of AI, yes, but also data centers more broadly, also advanced manufacturing and repatriation of manufacturing capacity, but also electric vehicles and other charging infrastructure and fleet electrification, but also electrification of other sectors, but also residential growth and things like heat pumps driving more of a winter peaking system. We are seeing changes in a lot of different ways, both in growth and in the assets that are a part of the broader grid. The other thing I like to talk about is if Thomas Edison woke up 15 years ago, he'd recognize the grid. Big spinning equipment, generating electrons, transmitting them over long distances, and distributing them out to customers. He wakes up today or in the next 5 years, very different generation profile, a lot of two-way flows, a lot of digital control, a lot of customer control, and a lot of what I would say, not good or bad. Mike and I talk about this in terms of cybersecurity. Yes, it's a broader attack surface, but it's also more assets being part of the grid creates more resiliency. But notice what I said, being a part of the grid. We EEI's members sort of think about it this way. It used to be that the pie was so small that everybody was fighting over the crumbs. We had flat or declining. We just needed to make sure that we were building infrastructure in a really thoughtful way to ensure we didn't have stranded assets, to ensure that we were maintaining affordability for our customers. And as I talk to state energy officials, but certainly as I talk to the regulatory community and others, affordability is always going to be job one. And so being able to get as much out of the existing system as we possibly can is critical. Now, with this growth and a number of different generating facilities, some things that are co-located, some things that are maybe owned behind the meter, but could be grid assets, maybe leveraging the existing grid with things like grid enhancing technologies and getting more efficiency out of the existing system. There are so many opportunities to continue to grow and meet this demand, but also do it in a really affordable, reliable, resilient way. There's this narrative out there that I find really frustrating that the grid and electric companies can't meet demand quickly enough, and that the regulated model somehow is too slow to meet this demand and the urgency of the moment. I don't agree with that, but I'll sort of defend it and explain why. There's also this notion sort of related to that, that because the grid can't meet the moment in the urgency to be energy dominant, to use the parlance of the Trump administration, and to be AI dominant, which is a national security imperative, right? AI needs data centers need electricity, needs infrastructure, so we got to build. In order to do that, we need to be able to we need to be able to build quickly. Got it. And so some of these AI companies are like, screw it, we'll just build it ourselves. Go back to what I said about having those assets not connected to the grid. When you dig just a little bit below that narrative of, oh, we'll just do it ourselves, the answer is rarely that that's what the AI or data center or manufacturers want to do. They recognize the value of being part of the broader ecosystem. If something goes wrong on their side of the meter and they are on their own, they're losing money. So having that resilience, having that grid as a backup is critical. We saw this once before, well, probably other times, but more recent memory, about 30 years ago with the military. The military had demand, the military had land. They're like, we'll do this. We'll get into the utility business. And about 5 years later, they're like, oh, being in the utility business is hard. And so ultimately interconnected with the grid. And it's so interesting, our companies, EEI's members, who would go on to Post and start to do the engineering to fix the system and ultimately integrate it into the broader grid. There were some really bad engineering decisions made. There were some really bad operational decisions made. And it made it really complicated to ultimately interconnect. I go through that because I want to skip to the end where any of these new customers who have huge demand go try to do it themselves. That's fine, especially if they want to do it themselves to meet an urgency, but do it with an eye toward ultimately interconnecting. Do it, make good engineering and good operational decisions today so we're not unscrewing it a few years from now when there is that opportunity to ultimately interconnect. So as you can tell, I am passionate about the grid's capacity and capability. I am passionate about EEI's members and electric companies broadly of their 140 years of operational experience. I am passionate about the value that the grid provides to national security, economic competitiveness, broader resilience. I mean, you think about storms and fires and things like that that happen. Think about Helene and Milton last year, 50,000 crews from all across North America descending on Western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina. Nobody else does that. And so when these incidents happen, you want to be a part of an organization or a platform or a community that ultimately can help restore power as quickly as possible. So that's one aspect of it is the grid is fit for purpose. The grid already is meeting demand in really innovative ways. It's already working in partnership with these gigantic data centers and AI providers, and they're ultimately doing it with an eye toward interconnection with the broader grid. But in order to be able to do it even more quickly, there are some policy issues that need to be addressed. Building out the transmission grid, it's not just for bringing renewables, from places where the sun shines all the time or where the wind blows all the time to where the people live. That's part of it, but it's about having a transmission grid that has the capacity to continue to allow for this growth. We need to have durable long-term plans for new generation. I use the word durable really purposefully. Having any of these, and it's not just emergency orders that might be coming out of the administration, having any of these goals to keep certain kinds of generation on does two things. One is those generation facilities were being shut down for a reason. They were no longer economical to operate. That said, getting rid of firm, baseload, reliable electricity is not a good plan. But going from coal, which is becoming less and less economical to run and more expensive to maintain, to gas, which has some great characteristics with it, let's make that transition to gas as quickly as we can. Renewables are not the answer to all of the problems, but they're also the thing that we can put on the system as quickly as possible. From a supply chain standpoint, like if you aren't in the queue to get a gas turbine right now, you're not getting one until 2031 or 2032. So let's build what we can build when we can build it. Let's have durable solutions so that we're not keeping something open under an emergency order and then having to fight it in court and not ultimately having it maintained or operational anyway. We need to be thinking holistically about how do we get as much electricity onto the grid to meet this demand as quickly as possible. And then from a supply chain standpoint, I mentioned it's not just things like gas turbines. There are any number of other assets that are going to be really difficult to come by. And whether it is AI and data center providers who are building their own generation on site, or whether it's electric companies, we're all competing for the same assets. I was talking to some of the biggest hyperscalers, and this is a fascinating statistic. So EEI's members are going to spend $200 billion in CapEx this year. It's actually probably going to be more just given the scope of the demand and the urgency. The big four, Meta, Google, Amazon, and who am I missing? Now, anyway, the big four are going to Microsoft. There we go. Are going to spend $200 billion on CapEx this year also. They don't want to spend that on energy infrastructure if they don't have to. They want to spend that on network infrastructure, on data centers, on real estate, on the things that they do that are their core competency, and the things that we do, we'll spend that money on our core competency. There is a way to do this in a thoughtful way, thinking holistically, so that we are not competing with them for the same assets, whether it's transformers, generation step-up units, things like that, and they are spending their money on the things they need to spend it on so that we can, as a nation, be AI dominant. The last thing I'll say is from a permitting and siting standpoint, it's not just transmission, it's also siting, generation, and all of that. One of the things that this administration has done really effectively has used executive orders, and one of their executive orders is on using federal lands, whether it's Department of Energy lab lands, whether it's military lands, whether it's other federal lands, to build infrastructure to support AI and energy dominance is something we very much can get behind. Again, with this notion that it is a part of the broader ecosystem, is a part of the broader grid. So a lot of partnerships between EEI and its members and those hyperscalers, the military, other large customers. This, how do we partner and do this in creative ways? Maybe they build it and then transfer operations to us. How do we work with states and the federal government to create sound policies that allow us to meet this moment? But also, how do we amplify those really creative solutions that already are happening so that it's not this notion like, oh, well, the grid can't do it, the regulated model is broken. I'm passionate and defensive of the regulated model because energy and electricity specifically are not nice to haves. These are critical to national security. These are critical to the health and safety of the communities. These are not something, it's kind of like healthcare, like you need it. And so having a regulated model that ensures we serve everybody is a really important construct that we can't lose. But we also have to recognize that the way the grid operates, the demand we see today, and the expectations of customers are evolving. So some aspects of that regulated model need to evolve as well. So that's probably as good a place as any to stop. Appreciate the time. And David or Campbell, look forward to some questions.
So Campbell, once again, we're looking for questions from the audience. Are you okay with folks just raising their hand or putting their name in the chat? We will call upon them. How do you want to play that, Campbell?
Really all of the above. We welcome questions in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand or just come on camera, and I think we'll be able to pick up from there. But in the meantime, Dave, we'll turn it to you for some warm-up questions.
Yeah, so Scott, I think I want to go back to something you said, and frankly, I like your vision of waking up 5 years from now and the grid looks entirely different. I'm not exactly sure if I believe that or not, but I think that I'm on board with that's what I would like to have happen. I think one of the scary aspects, and I use the word scary, aspect of this is that, as you mentioned, we had flat or declining growth for the last 10 or 15 years, and now we talk about sort of like this extreme ramp up even in the next 5 years. And when you start sort of like talking about, I believe you said there's a broader attack surface. And even though that may exist, especially with customer controls and two-way power flows, and there this large build out potentially behind the meter, but then also wanting to interconnect as the data center grows. You know, yes, we've been doing things in a sort of a slow and measured and thoughtful way. It appears that we're going to have to change that rapidly. There's a lot of pressure, obviously, economic pressure, security, national security issues, wanting to dominate this sector, so to speak. So, what are some things that we should be looking out for if we rush too much?
Um, I'll give you a couple. So I believe in the sort of biological imperative of biodiversity. And so if you put all of your eggs in, so if we become so dependent on one supplier or supply chain, that creates a concentration risk. Now, my point about the value of having lots of assets on the grid, and yes, that creates a broader attack surface, but it also creates sort of inherent resiliency because you have the ability to provide power in different ways, sort of across the broader grid. That's great, unless there is that concentration risk and that attack, that attack takes out all of your capability. We talk a lot about China, and I think we've lost Tucker, but he and I have spent plenty of time in classified space, but I can explain something in unclassified terms because the Director of National Intelligence since 2018 has put out an unclassified document called the Worldwide Threat Assessment. And in that Worldwide Threat Assessment in unclassified space, it says that China, Russia, and other near-peer nation states are looking to hold the United States critical infrastructure at risk at a time of their choosing. Now, the time of their choosing might be a tariff war. A time of their choosing might be Taiwan's repatriation to China. Time of their choosing might be conflict in Ukraine or anything related to that. Now, we've known that for a lot of years. The way to defend against that is sort of two ways. Theories of deterrence, right? And I'll get to one final answer in a second, but theories of deterrence. The first theory of deterrence is an attack does not have the intended impact. So cool, you attacked us, but we can still provide electricity. We can still project force externally. We can still do the things that we need to do. It might be a shot across the bow and it might be uncomfortable for some citizens, but ultimately you have not hurt the United States in the way that you wanted to. So attack doesn't have the intended impact. That's a deterrent. The other is the attack has a consequence, and that goes to the military's capabilities. And this is where so the first one is the electric power sectors. Like we have to engineer a grid that is really resilient. And then the other is firmly the government's responsibility. An attack has a consequence and we can attack back. The overlap of responsibility is now how much our force projection relies on domestic electric reliability and resilience. So this goes to why I say the electric power sector is critical to national security, period. So we have to think that way. The other thing I'll say is from the standpoint of that concentration risk and relying so much on things like Chinese supply chains, I like to ironically borrow a Chinese proverb. The Chinese proverb is the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time is today. The best time to combat Chinese industrial policy was 30 years ago. The second best time is today. As we build out this grid of the future, as we look to change the way the grid operates 5+ years from now, we need to do that with an eye toward as much manufacturing capacity here at home or at minimum near shore and friend shore. We need to be working with allies. We need to have supply chains we can rely on. We need to monitor those supply chains. There's still going to be things that we have to buy from China, but rather than ripping and replacing, and I love alliteration, we need to monitor and mitigate. So instead of ripping and replacing this material and equipment that is critical to operations, there are things you can do to make sure that it doesn't have the ability to undermine the reliability of the grid. So kind of a meandering answer to your really important question, but no concentration risk, have as much resilience and redundancy as possible, build out a grid to meet those demands, address supply chain challenges so that we have the material and equipment from places we can trust, and to the extent that we can't trust them, monitor and mitigate.
Thanks. Campbell, I've been looking for hands. I haven't seen any, so I will continue on with another question for Scott. Um, so put yourself in my shoes a little bit. So I'm the state energy director for Pennsylvania. I mentioned that, we're obviously have the restart of the TMI, Clean Energy Center. We have announcements in Pennsylvania with regards to Amazon, $20 billion investments. We raised our hand and said, hey, we think that we would like to have one of those data centers at one of the national labs here in Pennsylvania, and we'd like to see it be, maybe a small modular reactor powered. But what questions should I be asking, knowing that I have some responsibilities as the state, some responsibilities to my governor, some responsibilities to the citizens of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? What questions should I be asking about data centers from the standpoint of ensuring that they indeed are making our grid more reliable and not less reliable, and also, eventually more secure? Like what could what what aspects of data center computing and other potential, as you sort of mentioned earlier, like customer controls or further controls on a modern grid, what 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 could those opportunities deliver to us, and what should we be asking for? What questions should we be asking?
I love that. So a couple of things come to mind. I think the first is, as you build this asset, is it just for you as the big customer, or is it for the broader grid? And then, to the extent that it is for the broader grid, how do you allocate costs effectively? Um, One of the things that I think is particularly interesting, there's some pilot projects with some really new technology happening in Arizona right now, which is using AI and data center flexibility for as a grid asset. So as opposed to it always being 500 megawatts or a gigawatt of demand just nonstop, are there ways that it can ramp down and ramp up based on, again, sort of the inference and learning portion versus the actual sort of AI sort of query portion of its use cycle, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. Um, that's one set of things. Is how do you allocate the cost, and how is it helping the broader grid, or is it only a customer side asset? And I would argue that, especially as an energy director, especially thinking about the citizens of the Commonwealth and all the others that I'm talking to today, how do you think about how that asset helps the large customer, and how does it help the broader grid? I also understand that states are in kind of competition with each other for economic development, and so fully understand. Now, the good news is, again, I mentioned the pie is so big. I think there's so much demand out there that there's enough for kind of every state to win if they choose to play in this space. But I think that's something else that you need to consider is this something that we actually want as part of our system? Is the economic development worth it? Is the infrastructure build out worth it? And I think the answer in a lot of cases is yes. From a risk standpoint, I think one of the things that we saw I don't know how many people have tracked the Iberian outage in Spain and Portugal about a month or so ago, a month and a half ago. Um, Publicly blamed on renewables. I don't think that's a fair take on what actually happened. There was actually two large baseload generators. One tripped off that had impact on the other. It oscillated, and that created protection. What happened was the inverter-based resources, the renewables, have protection settings on them, and so they shut off so that they didn't get damaged by that voltage oscillation. I go through that because large customers, large data centers, can have similar impact on the grid. They can create large oscillations and ultimately have impact on the broader grid. We do need to start thinking about policies to actively disconnect those if we see anomalies. And that's anomalies that could be just kind of natural from such large load being consumed. That's true of data centers, that's true of crypto miners, that's true of a number of other really big customers. And then having those protection schemes so that when you see anomaly, and it could be because of malicious activity. And so if it's either of those things, there needs to be the ability for grid operators to actively disconnect those so it doesn't have broader impact. Now, the other thing I would say, and again, this goes to kind of the electric sector's culture of mutual assistance and sort of extraordinary resiliency capabilities, the thing that I think was most interesting about what happened in Spain and Portugal is they had to black start their system. So 63 million customers, I can't remember what the full gigawatt loss was, but they were restored in 18 hours. Now, I don't know. Like, I think some people would think, oh, well, they were out, so that's a failure to begin with. But to go from zero to fully restored in 18 hours is extraordinary. And I think it's a sign of maturity in the sector that we kind of talk about the uh, you can't protect everything from everything all the time. Acts of God are going to happen, storms, fires, you name it. Acts of war are going to happen. It's not the ability to stop all the bad things, it's to make sure bad days don't become catastrophic and then to be able to respond and recover and rebuild as quickly as possible. And again, that goes to one of the superpowers of the electric power sector. So again, kind of a longer answer to your question, but those are the kinds of things I think about is customer value and all customers, right? The big customers, but also the rest of the surrounding community. How does that help with economic development? And then ultimately, how do we protect the broader system from those really large customers?
Thanks for that answer. Looking back at you, Campbell, as to whether there were any questions, I'm not really. I'm focusing on Scott rather than on the chat, believe it or not. So
No, shockingly, no, nothing in the chat and no hands up here. So I'll put out. Oh, just kidding. We had one just come in here. Scott, can power provider agreements require notifications when data centers are going to have large spikes?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think a power agreement can kind of have any number of contingencies and sort of qualifications, and I think that's something we need to be thinking more about, especially as these really big demand centers come online.
Scott, what do you think about backup power? So you were talking about most of these data centers, you probably to some degree will want to connect to the grid. You obviously express benefits in connecting to the grid, but a lot of them also are going to have some percentage of on-site backup generation, and some of that concerns me as well from the standpoint of it's just another pathway, right, for risk. And when we're getting back to the sort of the subject of cyber. And so, could you talk a little bit about that as far as what you're seeing as far as backup power?
Yeah, there's a couple. So obviously the military is very good at that. We are seeing, I know people really like solar plus storage, and that storage being sort of a backup, kind of big battery to support large customers. Right now, we're not at a place where we can do much more than 4, maybe 6 hours of backup, depending on the size of the demand. I'm a big fan. I don't want to name companies, but there is a company that does, well, I'll name them. It's Enchanted Rock that I think does some really interesting work with large diesel and large gas turbines that can also be paired with storage that I think really make for interesting backup solutions for large customers. And then to the extent that those can be, again, connected to the broader grid and be leveraged, I think that's a great solution too. That helps with black start cranking path capability. That helps with, again, having a little bit more redundancy throughout the system. Does it create a more of an attack surface? Sure, but again, as long as you don't have that kind of concentration risk, and you've got a couple of different ways, now you're asking the adversary to attack a lot of different things simultaneously, and that's really, really hard.
Good. I think there's another one in the chat there, Campbell.
Yeah,
I like that. So the first one is renewables can be a bridge to natural gas when it comes to data centers. I think the answer is yes. Right? We talk about gas as a bridge fuel. I think renewables have a capability to be a bridge fuel as well. And then microgrids. So slightly different than backup power. What about microgrids operating whenever possible, allowing leveling demand? Yeah, so I think of microgrids as sort of similar to on-site co-located generation that supports the broader grid, whether it's a microgrid serving a university or a hospital complex or something like that isn't a whole lot different than a backup power serving a military installation or a data center or a data center farm. And I would also say that I think there's kind of this misnomer. I think microgrids, well, not I think microgrids already exist, and they exist certainly on military installations and universities and things like that. But the electric grid broadly is a grid of grids. in its simplest form, a microgrid is generation being matched up to demand. And so there are a lot of, again, the grid is a grid of grids. And so having more purpose-built microgrids that serve specific customers or specific communities for a specific reason, then being part of that broader ecosystem, I think that's a great solution as well. See, we got people going. Uh, so what policies could data centers need to implement to improve recovery? Yeah, so right. Black Start and one of the challenges that I see is in certain parts of the country, and Dave maybe picking on PJM a little bit, a lot of the Black Start capability, well, it's not owned at all by the utilities. In some cases, it's by private equity. In others, it's just general independent power generators. And that gives me heartburn, right? Is the people responsible for restoration ought to also have responsibility for Black Start. Now, I know those Black Start units are sort of paid differently to be more reliable when we need them. But I do have a little bit of heartburn around, are those there when we need them? And what they were able to do, and I don't know the full details of the Iberian Black Start. I actually want to learn it and am hoping to, EPRI is doing a webinar at the end of this month, the Electric Power Research Institute, for folks who don't know. But my understanding is, one, they leverage a heck of a lot of hydro. That always helps. Hydro's always running. But they also had some interesting diesel capabilities that I want to learn a little bit more about. So that's one thing. I want better Black Start capability. And then the other thing is I want that ability to disconnect if I see something crazy happening, whether it's just natural in the way that that customer is operating, or whether it's something malicious and adversaries are manipulating those large loads to ultimately have broader grid impact. That's the kind of stuff we need to be able to protect against. And I think that's a sort of emerging set of risks that people are sort of contemplating, but they're going to need some policy behind them at both the federal and state level. Another question, sorry. Major data center customers have clean energy goals. Are those goals largely dead? No. Obviously, that's a better question for the customers themselves. Many of their pledges were sort of made on their own. But in the conversations I've had with some of the large tech companies, they remain committed to their goals. Now, the timing of those goals may evolve. They have business needs to be able to build stuff as quickly as possible, and whatever it is that they build might not completely align with their climate or clean energy pledges. But I think they still see some of their pledges in 2040 and 2050 as attainable, but maybe with a little bit of a hiccup between now and 2030, 2032.
Scott, I feel like I'm being a bad host here, having to read the questions in the chat to yourself. So
I'm happy to
apologize.
do it.
I apologize for that. This is maybe a question for you, but also maybe a question for the rest of the group. When I think about our state energy security planning as a state energy office, there's a number of things that we do, right? We assess risks, right? We assess threats. We identify what our infrastructure looks like, what are key assets that are a part of our grid, whether that be the electricity grid, or maybe it's the natural gas pipelines and compressor stations, or it's petroleum pipelines and where they're located. And certainly we always think about like restoration, which is part of the sort of backup generation conversation that we had. And of course it makes sense that, if you have a power outage or you have a significant event that happens within your state, whether it's a weather event or it's social unrest or whatever that may be, disaster, there are certain things that are public assets like hospitals and first responders that are the priorities for essentially restoration. Going forward, as you were mentioning, data centers, they want to be up and running 100% of the time. Essentially, they're also providing likely computing power that operates some of these facilities that we're talking about, like hospitals and, first responder stations and communications and all the rest of these things. You know, what should we, this is for everybody, not just you. I'm seeing you on camera here, but I'm just sort of throwing this out to everybody. This waking up 5 years from now, are we going to be looking at the power of surety to these data centers as being a primary, restoration opportunity akin to what we would normally think of as sort of like, public facilities that are critical to our health and well-being in recovering from a disaster. And I know that communication systems getting towards using these things, like the one I have, is satellite uplink, this one right here, right? Because of my energy assurance duties, right? Because communications is important. Well, as we tie all this data and data centers and computing power, yes, maybe it can be shifted to being a continent away and it will still work. But are there thoughts around maybe how we should be including these assets into our security and reliability and restoration plans?
So I'll start, but I would love to hear maybe others chime in as well. So I'll say it this way. First is, look, if everything's a priority, nothing is a priority. And so there's a concept in mutual assistance and in just restoration broadly of you have to do life saving first, then you do life support, and then you do life sustaining. And so life saving, and look, uh, the Hurricane Maria outages in Puerto Rico are probably the best example of a catastrophic black sky event where basically everything was gone. And just to give a quick example, right? We were pushing diesel fuel and bottled water to the island in order to keep them just to have some generators and water. But that was crowding out people able to go in and actually do the other work of getting to that life supporting portion, where we can actually start to rebuild the grid and then ultimately get past that and sustain life going forward. Um, we have to think, so first responders and hospitals are absolutely number one. That's life saving. Then you go to grocery stores and some other kind of critical facilities. That becomes that life supporting. Um, we have to have a really hard conversation with all of these large customers about where they fall in that prioritization schema. I'd put the military up there too, especially when we're talking about having to be able to project force as a nation, having mission assurance for our military men and women. So it goes to two things. One is prioritizing effectively and logically, and that is a decision for policymakers in coordination with those really large customers, because we don't always know who they serve. It might be supporting some of those things I was just talking about. And then how do we, and then work with electric companies to make sure that they're sort of in the appropriate sort of racking and stacking of what we're going to restore. And then the other part is, if you're not in that top one or two tiers, you've got to be prepared as a customer to take care of yourself. And that goes to backup power, and that goes to what is their downtime? What is comfortable for them as knowing who their customers are? If they are a data center serving 911, their downtime is zero. They can't be down. If they are serving, TikTok cat videos, okay, you know what? I'm not quite as worried about that. But we have to have an honest conversation.
Yeah, and sort of my point that I was putting out to everyone else is I think these are the things that we probably need to know. And it's hard to be informed as to whether it's supporting 911 or it's supporting cat video TikToks, and it might be doing both, frankly, right? And so this is how these things become intertwined. Our society is so much more powered by data and mobile signals and Wi-Fi and all the rest of that, right? And so I think it's an interesting question when we talk about this, as I think somebody said, or I think we said earlier, by 2050, right? Like the power use for data centers, exceeds our heating and cooling load or whatever that may be. That's probably because it's controlling our heating and cooling load too.
Mm. So agree completely. And I think, again, we need to be the large customer needs to be working with this broader community in order to make sure that they're not just doing it on their own. And if they're doing it on their own, they're on their own. But I think being part of the broader grid, and then ultimately having their own backup to the extent that it makes sense, based on what they're serving, and it might be emergency cat videos. I love that. So there was another question. The geothermal, the answer is I don't know. I think there are some creative solutions out there that I've heard a little bit about, of using geothermal and other cooling capability to kind of reduce some of the power demand, but not the compute demand. So the answer is I don't know. And are we trying to persuade the big four from going forward with behind the meter? No, we are trying to kind of partner with them. I think they're coming to the conclusion themselves that they would rather be part of the broader grid. So it's not really a persuasion, it's what are the right business models that make sense? Is it a build, transfer, operate? Is it build their own thing, ultimately with an eye toward fully interconnecting? Is it fully behind the meter and screw everybody else? And if that's the case, that's fine, but that's not ideal. So maybe, yes, it is true. I guess we're trying to persuade, like, we think that it would be better to have large customers part of the grid, both for business, but also that ultimately is an asset for the broader grid. And to Mike's words earlier, that becomes that rising tide that lifts all boats. So yeah, maybe we're persuading, but I think they're coming to that conclusion on their own, much like the military did 30 plus years ago.
Last thought from you, Scott. I think that you were maybe had to drop at 4:15 or something. So any final thoughts?
We're getting there. No, thank you. There's one last question, and it's from a guy named Scott, so I have to answer it. Data center, actually glad you asked this. Load forecasting and the interconnection queue is an utter mess, and we are triple and quadruple counting, and there's absolutely venue shopping. And I think we need a better system for the queue to prove that the demand is really going to materialize. And that's something that as state energy officials and your regulators, and you guys need to really help us with, because there is definitely a whole cottage industry of folks kind of venue shopping to see where they might build. We don't really know what demand is real. And until you actually get some money behind that build, there's the risk of a stranded asset. There's the risk of us building a thing that's ultimately unnecessary. There's a risk of kind of going through a whole cycle of planning that ultimately wastes time where we could have been planning elsewhere. So yeah, I think that's a really important point, is we need to do a better job with the interconnection queue and find out what's real, so that we can make well-informed decisions about build. And that's actually probably a really good place to end. Yeah, it's been a privilege to talk to y'all. If I can be, or if EEI or the team here can be helpful in any way, always enjoyed working with NASEO. Certainly when I was doing a lot of my cyber stuff, remember talking to this community a lot about maybe 10 years ago. So I know you guys are the leaders in your states, and want to be as helpful as we can as we do this at the federal level, certainly at the state and regional levels, and the ISOs and the RTOs, and as electric companies work with these large customers of all different stripes, not just AI. I know that's what we're focused on, but there's a lot of growth happening, and we want to be a part of the solution. So look forward to helping you help us make this happen.
I want to thank you, Scott, for carrying the water during this panel, and even reading and answering your own questions in the chat. So that was going above and beyond. Also want to thank Mike Tucker too, who had to drop, but I thought he picked us off rather well. And so thank you for your time. Campbell, I'll throw it back to you as to whether you want to continue on with a couple other questions or call it a day.
Great. Well, in the historical vein of having some time for open discussion, I think we'll close out the formal presentation and the recording